They said she came with the house, like a broken table or a rusted stove. But no one warned him she would look him in the eye. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you believe some things in this world can't be owned, stay with me. The wind moved slow across the dry plains that afternoon, carrying dust in long, lazy lines, and Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his newly bought property, a place barely worth the $40 he had paid, a leaning shack, a crooked fence, and silence that stretched for miles, the kind of silence a man could disappear into. He had wanted that, needed it even, after years of people making promises they never kept, after learning that everything in this world came down to a trade, something for something, no exceptions. That was the rule he lived by now. So when the man in town slid the paper across the table and muttered, "House comes with a girl," Ethan hadn't asked questions, hadn't cared enough to. People out here said a lot of things. Most of them weren't worth listening to. But now, standing on that dry patch of land, boots sinking half an inch into the dust, he felt something off before he even reached the door. It wasn't the place. He'd seen worse, lived in worse. It was the stillness, like the air itself was waiting. The wooden door creaked open with a slow push, the sound stretching longer than it should, and inside, the light cut through cracks in the wall, thin beams across the floor, and that's when he saw her. She stood near the far wall, not hiding, not stepping forward, just there, as if she had been there long before he arrived, and would be there long after he left. Dark hair, loose over her shoulders, dust on her dress, but nothing about her looked defeated, nothing about her said she belonged to anyone. Ethan paused, just for a second, the kind of pause a man like him didn't allow himself often. Then he stepped inside, slow, measured, the boards under his boots answering with low groans. He didn't speak at first, didn't need to. Men like him were used to silence doing the work, but she didn't lower her gaze, didn't shift, didn't give him that small sign of submission he had come to expect without realizing it. Instead, she watched him, steady, calm, like she was the one trying to understand what kind of man had just walked into her space. Ethan reached for the table by the wall, more out of habit than purpose, and that's when his hand brushed against something cold, something that hadn't been there a second ago, or maybe he just hadn't seen it. A silver chain slipped from the edge and hit the floor with a clean, sharp sound that cut through the quiet. Both of them looked down at it, but only one of them seemed surprised. Ethan bent, picking it up between rough fingers, turning it slowly as the light caught the small carved symbol at its center, something precise, something deliberate, not the kind of thing that ended up in a place like this by accident. He frowned, eyes narrowing just slightly, then lifted his gaze back to her, and for the first time, he noticed the way her shoulders were set, not tense, not afraid, just ready. "You work here?" he asked, voice low, flat, the kind of question that wasn't really a question. She took one step forward, just one, and the distance between them felt smaller than it should have, like the room itself had shifted. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried, steady as the ground beneath them. "I'm not who you ordered," she said. The words didn't sound like defiance, didn't sound like fear either. They sounded like truth, plain and simple. And for a moment, Ethan didn't move, didn't blink, because something about the way she said it didn't fit into any deal he had ever made. Outside, somewhere beyond the thin walls, a horse shifted, then another, the soft rhythm of hooves against dirt, not rushing, not loud, just there, like a presence waiting to be noticed. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the chain, his mind working through possibilities, through explanations that felt smaller by the second. "Everyone's someone," he said finally, though the words came out slower than he intended. She tilted her head just enough to catch the light in her eyes, and there was something there he couldn't name, something that didn't belong to a person who had been traded for a piece of land. "Not to the man who sold this place," she replied. The wind pressed lightly against the walls, a low breath through cracks and corners, and Ethan realized, standing there in that dim room, that whatever he had bought for $40, it wasn't what he thought, and whatever stood in front of him now, it wasn't something he could measure, trade, or walk away from like the rest of the world he had left behind. The chain felt heavier the longer Ethan held it, like it carried more than silver and carved lines, and he did not like things he could not measure, did not trust weight that came without reason. So he set it down on the table, slow, deliberate, like returning something that did not belong to him. The woman did not move to take it, did not even glance at it again, her attention still fixed on him in that quiet, steady way that made the room feel smaller than its walls. Outside, the soft rhythm of hooves shifted again, closer now, not many, but enough that a man who lived by instinct would notice. Ethan noticed. He turned his head slightly toward the door, listening, then back to her. "You expecting someone?" he asked, voice calm. But there was an edge under it now, the kind that came when a man realized he might not be alone in a situation he thought he understood. She shook her head once, slow, not dismissive, just certain. "They are not coming for me," she said. The answer should have eased him, but it did not, because it left a space where the truth should have been. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose and stepped back, giving himself room to think, boots scraping lightly against the wood. He had walked into plenty of uncertain situations before, cattle deals gone wrong, men who smiled too easily, land that did not belong to the man selling it. But this was different. There was no noise here, no raised voices, no threats, just stillness, and something beneath it that refused to show itself. "Then who are they coming for?" he asked. She watched him for a moment, like weighing whether the answer mattered. Then her gaze shifted past him, toward the door, toward the horizon beyond the thin walls. "That depends," she said quietly. Ethan did not like answers that came in pieces, so he moved, crossing the room in 3 slow steps and pushing the door open wider, letting the light spill in. The plain stretched out in long lines of faded gold and dust, heat rising in soft waves. And there, about 50 yards from the house, stood 3 riders, still in their saddles, not approaching, not retreating, just waiting. They were not dressed like townsmen, not like traders or ranch hands. Their posture alone said enough. Straight, patient, deliberate. Ethan studied them, eyes narrowing, counting without thinking, measuring distance, angles, options, the way a man does when he has spent too long relying on himself. None of them reached for anything, none of them signaled, and yet their presence filled the space between them and the house like a line drawn in the dust. He stepped back inside, closing the door halfway, not hiding, just narrowing the world again. 3 riders, he said, more to himself than to her. She nodded once, as if she already knew. "They have been there since before you arrived," she said. Ethan paused, that small, quiet pause again, the kind that came when something did not fit into the order of things. "And you did not think to mention that?" he asked. There was no anger in his voice, only curiosity now, sharp and focused. She met his gaze without flinching. "You did not ask," she replied. The answer settled between them, simple, undeniable. And for the first time, Ethan felt the edges of his usual certainty begin to shift. He walked back to the table, eyes flicking once more to the chain, then to her. "You said you are not who I ordered," he began, choosing each word carefully. "So tell me who you are." She did not answer right away. Instead, she took another step forward, closing the distance until the light from the doorway touched her face fully, revealing details he had missed before. The fine lines of the carving on the chain now mirrored in the patterns stitched into her clothing. The way she held herself not like someone placed here, but like someone who had allowed it, for reasons he could not yet see. When she finally spoke, her voice was still quiet, but it carried something new. Something that felt less like a statement and more like a warning. "I am someone your town should not have tried to sell," she said. Outside, one of the horses shifted again, a low sound in the still air, and Ethan realized, standing there with dust on his boots and a $40 deed in his pocket, that whatever line had been drawn out there, it was not just waiting for him to cross it. It was waiting to see what kind of man he would be when he did. The air inside the shack felt different now, like it had shifted without moving. And Ethan Cole stood there with his weight balanced just slightly back on his heels, the way a man does when he realizes the ground under him might not be as solid as he thought. He glanced once more at the chain on the table, then back at her, and something about the way the light caught the carved symbol made a memory stir, faint, distant, like a sound carried from miles away. He did not trust memories that came without warning, so he pushed it aside and focused on what was in front of him. "Your town," he repeated quietly, testing the words she had chosen, because they were not careless, They were not accidental. They carried distance, separation. She did not belong to this place, not in the way the man at the trading post had implied. She stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, shoulders steady, and for the first time, Ethan noticed that her stillness was not emptiness. It was control, like she was holding something back, something that did not need to be shown to be felt. Outside, the horses shifted again, closer now by a few yards, not enough to threaten, just enough to remind. Ethan turned slightly, looking through the narrow gap of the door, and saw that the three riders had not moved much, but the distance between them and the house had shortened, quiet as a shadow stretching in the late afternoon. No dust kicked up, no urgency, just intention. He closed the door again, slower. This time, as if measuring the sound it made. Men out there do not look like traitors, he said. She gave the smallest nod. They are not. Then what are they? He asked. She did not answer right away, and the silence that followed was not empty. It pressed, it waited, and Ethan felt it settle into his chest. He had spent years learning how to read people, to see the truth behind what was said, but this woman did not offer the usual signs. No fear, no hesitation, no attempt to shape his reaction. She simply stood in her truth and let him decide what to do with it. They are waiting, she said finally. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a dry laugh without humor. That much I can see, she tilted her head slightly, studying him again. And there was something different now, not judgment, not challenge, something closer to curiosity. Most men would already be outside, she said. Ethan shrugged one shoulder, slow, controlled. Most men would already be wrong, he replied. The words settled between them, and for the first time, the corner of her mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something that acknowledged the answer. Ethan stepped closer to the table again, his eyes drawn once more to the chain, and this time he picked it up more carefully, turning it so the symbol faced the light. The carving was not rough, not something done in haste. It was precise, deliberate, every line placed with purpose. And as he looked at it, that faint memory pressed harder, the image of a riverbank, the sound of water moving over stone, a small hand gripping something just like this. He stilled, breath catching for the smallest fraction of a second, then released it. I have seen this before, he said, more to himself than to her. She watched him closely now, and for the first time, there was a shift in her posture, subtle, but real, like a door opening just a crack. Where? She asked. Ethan shook his head once, slow. Does not matter, he said, though the truth was it mattered more than he wanted to admit. Outside, one of the riders dismounted, the movement quiet but unmistakable, and the other two remained in place, forming a line that did not move, did not break. Ethan set the chain down again, more gently this time, and looked at her fully. You said they are not here for you, he began, voice steady. But they are not here by accident either. She met his gaze without hesitation. Nothing out here happens by accident, she said. The words hung in the air, simple, certain, and Ethan felt the weight of them settle into the moment. He moved toward the door again, hand resting lightly on the wood, not opening it yet, just feeling the barrier between inside and out. If they are not here for you, he said slowly, and they are not here by accident, then that leaves one thing. He turned his head just enough to look back at her, eyes narrowing slightly as the pieces began to fall into place. They are here because of me. She did not answer with words this time. Only a small, almost invisible nod. And in that quiet confirmation, Ethan Cole understood something he had not expected when he handed over $40 in a dusty room. Whatever deal had been made in town, whatever lie had been wrapped around it, had reached further than a piece of land and a silent house. And now it stood outside his door, patient, waiting, not to take what he owned, but to see what he would choose to stand for. The words settled between them like dust that refused to lift, and Ethan Cole felt the shape of it take hold before he could push it away, because it was one thing to walk into a bad deal, and another to realize the deal had been built around you from the start. He rested his hand against the door, fingers spread flat against the rough wood, feeling the faint vibration of movement outside, not loud, not urgent, just present. Like time itself had slowed to watch what he would do next. He had lived long enough to know that most men chose quickly when they were afraid, and most of those choices followed them longer than they expected. Ethan did not move quickly. He opened the door just an inch more, enough to see without stepping out, enough to let the light draw a thin line across the floor behind him. The rider who had dismounted now stood beside his horse, still as the others, and though the distance was no more than 50 yards, it felt stretched by something unseen, something heavier than space. None of them reached for anything, none of them spoke, but their attention was clear. It rested on the house, on the door, on him. Ethan closed the door again, not out of fear, but out of thought, narrowing the world back to the space he could control. He turned slowly, looking at her, really looking this time, not as something included in a purchase, not as a question, but as an answer he had not understood yet. "You knew this would happen," he said, not accusing, just stating what had become obvious. She did not deny it. "I knew someone would come," she said, "but not how you would stand when they did." Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a dry chuckle that never reached his eyes. "That makes two of us," he replied. The chain on the table caught his attention again, not by sight, but by the weight it seemed to carry in the room, and he picked it up once more, slower now, as if handling something that had earned a different kind of respect. He turned it in his hand, and this time the memory did not stay distant. It came closer, clearer, the sound of water moving steady over stone, the sun low on the horizon, and a figure smaller than him, younger, standing knee-deep in a river that moved faster than it looked. He had not been a different man then, just a quieter one, less certain of what the world would demand from him. He remembered reaching out, steadying that small figure as the current pulled, remembered the way something cold had pressed into his palm afterward, a gift, or maybe a promise, something he had not kept. Ethan stilled, the present settling back around him like dust after wind. He lifted his eyes to her again, and for the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, only recognition forming slowly, carefully. "That chain," he said, voice lower now. "It was given to someone who helped your people." She did not answer with words, but her eyes shifted, just enough, confirming more than any explanation could. Outside, the man standing beside his horse took one step forward, not closing the distance fully, just enough to show intention, and the other two remained where they were, forming a line that did not need to move to hold its ground. Ethan set the chain back down, but this time he did not let go right away, his fingers resting on it as if measuring something beyond its weight. "Town said this place came with you," he continued, choosing his words carefully now. "But that is not how this works, is it?" She stepped closer, stopping just within the light that crossed the floor, and the symbol on the chain seemed to echo in the quiet space between them. "No," she said softly. "It is not." Ethan nodded once, slow, as if accepting something he could not change, only respond to. He moved away from the table then, past her, toward the door again, his steps steady, unhurried, and when he reached it, he did not hesitate this time. He opened it fully and stepped out onto the dry ground, the sun lower now, casting long shadows that stretched toward the waiting riders. The air outside felt wider, clearer, but heavier all the same. He did not raise his voice, did not call out. He simply stood there, facing them, a man with nothing in his hands and everything in his choice. Behind him, inside the quiet house, the chain lay still on the table, catching the last of the light, and for the first time since he had crossed that threshold, Ethan Cole was not standing in something he had bought. He was standing in something he had to decide. The dirt outside the shack felt firm under Ethan Cole's boots, but not steady, not the way ground should feel when a man knows where he stands. And he did not move any closer to the riders, not yet, because distance had its own language out here, and he had learned to listen before he spoke. The three men watched him without shifting, without signaling, their horses calm, heads low, as if they had been standing there long before he arrived and would still be there long after this moment passed. The one who had stepped forward earlier now stood a few paces ahead of the others, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as someone chosen to speak without needing to raise his voice. Ethan stopped just outside the doorway, the shadow of the house stretching behind him, and for a brief second he felt the line between inside and outside, between what he had been and what he was about to become. He rested his hands at his sides, open, empty, and met the man's gaze. No one spoke. The wind moved first, brushing low across the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of horses and dust, and then the man inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small most men would miss it. But Ethan did not. It was not respect, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. "You came a long way to stand still," Ethan said, his voice even, not raised, just enough to carry across the 50 yards between them. The man studied him, then answered in a tone just as measured. "We came to see what kind of man lives here now." The words settled into the space between them, simple, direct, and heavier than any threat could have been. Ethan nodded once, accepting the truth of it. "And if you do not like what you see?" he asked. The man did not hesitate. "Then we would not still be standing." There was no tension in his voice, no anger, only fact, and that made Ethan breathe a little slower, because he understood men who spoke like that. He had been one himself. Behind him, he could feel the presence of the house, the quiet inside it, the weight of the chain left on the table, and the woman who had said she was not who he ordered. He did not turn to look at her. He did not need to. "Town sold me this land," Ethan said, shifting his weight slightly, the movement small but deliberate. "Said it came with everything on it." The man's eyes did not leave him. "Land can be sold," he replied, "but not everything that stands on it." Ethan let that sit, because it matched what he already knew. He reached into his pocket slowly, not for a weapon, not for anything that would change the air between them, but for the folded paper he had been given in that dusty room in town. He held it for a moment, then unfolded it, the dry sound of paper carrying faintly in the open space. "This says different," he said, not as a challenge, just as a statement of what he had been told. The man's gaze flicked briefly to the paper, then back to Ethan. "Paper says many things," he answered. "Truth does not. Need it." Ethan felt something in his chest settle at that. Not ease, not comfort, but clarity. He folded the paper again, slower this time, and looked out past the man to the horizon beyond, where the land stretched out without fences, without markers, just open and waiting. "And her?" Ethan asked, bringing his eyes back. "What does truth say about her?" The man did not answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the distance by a few feet, enough to show intention, not enough to force anything. "Truth says she was not meant to stand in a place like this," he said. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in thought. He turned his head then, just enough to glance back at the doorway, where the shadow still held its shape, where the inside of the house remained quiet and unchanged. When he faced the riders again, there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there when he first stepped onto this land. "Then she will not," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried, and the man in front of him studied him for a long moment, as if weighing not the words, but the way they had been said. Behind that man, the other two riders shifted slightly in their saddles, not restless, not uncertain, just aware. The wind moved again, a little stronger this time, lifting dust in a thin line between them, and for a moment it felt like the land itself was watching, waiting for the next step. Ethan did not move forward, did not step back. He stood where he was, between the house behind him and the riders ahead, and in that space, the choice he had made settled into something real, something that could not be traded or undone. The man gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not approval, but recognition, and in that quiet exchange, Ethan Cole understood that this was not about what he had bought, or what he could claim, but about whether he was willing to stand in a truth that did not belong to him, and whether he would hold that ground when it was tested. The man's nod did not end the moment. It deepened it, like a quiet agreement that something had shifted without anyone needing to say it aloud. And Ethan Cole felt that shift settle into his stance, into the way his shoulders held steady under the weight of a choice that no longer felt like a burden but a line he had already crossed. The wind moved again, slower now, carrying a low hum through the dry grass, and for a moment the land felt wider, like it had opened just enough to let truth breathe. The man in front took another measured step, closing the distance to something closer to 40 yards, still not near enough to threaten, but near enough to speak without raising his voice. "You understand what you are saying," he said, not as a question, but as a check, the kind men use when words carry consequences beyond the moment. Ethan did not look away. "I do," he answered. The paper in his hand felt lighter now, like it had already lost its meaning, and without ceremony, without anger, he folded it once more and slipped it back into his pocket, not as something he believed in, but as something he had outgrown. Behind him, he heard the faint shift of wood, the subtle sound of movement from inside the house, and he knew she had stepped closer to the doorway, not to stand beside him, not yet, but close enough to see what kind of man he had chosen to be. The riders noticed it too, not by turning, not by reacting, but by the way their stillness adjusted, as if the presence behind Ethan had weight. The man's gaze flicked once past Ethan's shoulder, then returned, and something in his expression softened, not fully, but enough to show recognition of something beyond the surface. "She should not have been left here," he said. Ethan nodded once. "She will not be," he replied. The simplicity of the answer held more than explanation could have, and for a moment, no one moved. The horses shifted their weight, leather creaked softly, and the sky above had begun to change, the light lowering, stretching shadows longer across the ground. Ethan took a step forward then, small, deliberate, closing the space between himself and the riders by just a few feet, enough to show that he was not holding ground out of fear, but out of choice. "Town made a mistake," he said, his voice steady, "but it is not one I will carry forward." The man studied him again, longer this time, eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something beneath the words, something that would reveal doubt or weakness. He did not find it. Instead, he gave another small nod, this one slower, deeper, and behind him, the two riders adjusted in their saddles, their posture easing just slightly, not relaxed, but no longer holding the same edge. The man then did something that changed the air in a way no raised voice ever could. He placed his hand lightly against his chest, not over his heart, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. A gesture older than the town that had made the deal, older than the paper in Ethan's pocket. Ethan did not mirror the gesture, but he did not need to. He understood it. "We will take her back," the man said, calm, certain. Ethan glanced back then, just once, toward the doorway, where she now stood in the fading light, her silhouette clear against the dim interior, and in that brief look, something passed between them, not spoken, not fully understood, but real. When he turned back to the riders, his expression had not changed, but his voice carried something new, something that came from a place deeper than habit. "You will," he said, "but not like this." The words did not challenge, they redirected, and for the first time, the man in front paused, not long, just enough to consider what had been said. The wind lifted again, brushing between them, carrying dust in a thin line that blurred the ground for a second before settling again, and in that brief moment, the line between what had been arranged and what would happen next shifted. Ethan Cole stood there, between a house he no longer claimed and a truth he had chosen to stand with, and he knew that what came next would not be decided by ownership or paper, but by something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, not because they were loud, but because they refused to settle, and the man standing 40 yards away did not answer right away, his eyes narrowing just enough to show he was no longer measuring Ethan as a stranger, but as something less predictable. The wind slipped between them again, softer now, like it had decided to listen instead of move, and Ethan Cole held his ground without shifting, not pushing forward, not stepping back, because he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by distance. The man's gaze flicked briefly past Ethan once more, toward the doorway where she stood, then returned, slower this time, more deliberate. "Not like this," he repeated, testing the weight of the words. Ethan nodded once, the motion small but firm. "You came to take her," he said, voice even. "But you are standing outside like you are waiting for permission." The man's expression did not change, but something in his posture did. A slight shift of the shoulders, a breath taken a fraction deeper. "We are waiting," he said, "to see if we need it." The truth of that settled between them, clear and sharp, and Ethan let it sit, because he respected men who did not hide behind softer words. He glanced back again, just briefly, and this time she had stepped fully into the doorway, the light from outside outlining her form, not hiding, not stepping forward. Either, just present, like she had chosen to stand exactly where she needed to be. You do not need it, Ethan said, turning back to the riders. But you will not take her like something that was traded in a room she never stood in. The man studied him for a long moment, and behind him, one of the other riders shifted in his saddle, not out of impatience, but awareness, like the ground itself had changed under them. And what would you have us do? The man asked. The question was not sharp, not challenging, but it carried weight, because it asked for more than refusal. It asked for direction. Ethan let out a slow breath, feeling the shape of the answer before he spoke it, because it was not something he had planned, not something he had carried into this moment. It was something that had formed the second he understood what had been wrong from the start. You will ask her, he said. The wind moved again, lifting a thin line of dust between them, and for a second it blurred the space, then settled back down. The man did not look surprised, but he did not answer immediately either, and that pause was enough to show that the suggestion had weight. She stands in your house, he said carefully. Ethan shook his head once. No, he replied. She stands in a place I paid for. That does not make it mine to decide who she is. The words came steady, without force, and for the first time, the tension that had held the air began to shift, not breaking, but loosening. Behind the man, the two riders exchanged a glance, brief, silent, and then stilled again. The man in front looked past Ethan one more time, and this time his gaze held there a second longer, acknowledging her presence not as something behind a man, but as someone standing on her own. And if she chooses to stay? He asked. Ethan did not hesitate. Then she stays, he said. And if she chooses to leave? The man continued. Then she leaves, Ethan answered. The simplicity of it stripped everything else away. The deal, the paper, the town, all of it reduced to something smaller than the moment standing in front of them. The man let out a breath, slow, controlled, and then he did something no one had done since. Arriving, he turned his body slightly, not toward Ethan, but toward the doorway, toward her. The movement was not sudden, not forced, it was deliberate, and it carried respect. Ethan did not move, did not speak. He simply stood where he was, allowing the space to shift without stepping into it. The man took one step forward, then stopped, still leaving distance, still holding that line that had been drawn from the beginning. You have been silent, he said, his voice carrying now not toward Ethan, but toward the doorway. But silence does not mean you have no choice. The words moved through the air and settled where she stood, and for the first time since Ethan had opened that door, the moment no longer belonged to him or the men outside. It belonged to her. The wind stilled, the horses quieted, and even the light seemed to pause as if the land itself was waiting for what would come next, not from a man who had bought something, not from men who had come to take it back, but from the one person who had never been asked what she wanted. For a moment, nothing moved, not the riders, not the wind, not even the fading light that stretched across the dry ground, and Ethan Cole felt the weight of that stillness settle deeper than anything spoken so far, because silence like this did not come from hesitation. It came from truth waiting to be claimed. She stood in the doorway, framed by shadow and light, her eyes moving from the man who had spoken to the one who had stepped aside, and there was no fear in them, no urgency, only a quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning, now finally given space to breathe. The man outside did not rush her, did not press, he simply waited, and in that waiting there was more respect than any demand could carry. Ethan remained where he was, hands loose at his sides, shoulders steady, not turning, not stepping closer, because this moment was not his to shape anymore. The chain inside the house caught the last edge of sunlight, a faint glint through the open doorway, and she glanced at it once, just once, before her gaze returned forward. You came for me, she said, her voice calm, carrying across the space without strain. The man inclined his head slightly, the same measured acknowledgement as before. We came because you were taken where you did not choose to go, he answered. She let that settle, not denying it, not rushing to accept it either, as if the words were only part of something larger. Her eyes shifted then, briefly, toward Ethan, not as a question, not as a request, but as recognition. And in that glance something passed between them that had nothing to do with the deal made in town, nothing to do with land or paper. Ethan held that look for just a second, then gave the smallest nod, not telling her what to do, only confirming what he had already said without words. She stepped forward then, one slow step out of the doorway, onto the dry ground where the shadows stretched long, and the air seemed to shift with her, like the land itself acknowledged the movement. The riders did not move, but their attention sharpened, focused fully now on her. "If I leave," she said, her voice steady, "will not be because I was taken again." The man's expression remained calm, but there was something deeper in his eyes now, something that recognized the line she was drawing. "Then it will be because you choose it," he replied. She took another step forward, closing the space between shadow and open ground, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, she stood fully in the light, not hidden, not held back, just present. The wind moved again, lifting strands of her hair slightly, carrying the quiet scent of dust and distance. "And if I do not choose it?" she asked. The question did not challenge, it clarified. The man did not hesitate. "Then we leave," he said. The simplicity of the answer settled into the moment like something final, something that could not be bent or twisted. Behind him, the other two riders remained still, their posture unchanged, but the space around them felt different now, less like a line drawn and more like a path waiting to be taken or left behind. She stood there for a long breath, then another, the silence stretching, but no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, just full. Ethan watched without moving, without speaking, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to decide anything, only to witness it. She turned her head slightly then, looking out past the riders, past the horizon that stretched beyond them, and whatever she saw there was enough. When she looked back, her voice carried something new, not doubt, not hesitation, but choice. "Then you will leave," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried, and for a moment, even the wind seemed to pause again, as if the land itself understood what had just been spoken. The man studied her, not with surprise, not with resistance, but with acceptance, and slowly, he inclined his head once more, deeper this time. The gesture clear, final. "Then we leave," he repeated. He turned then, not sharply, not with urgency, but with the same deliberate calm he had held from the start, and the other two riders followed without question. The horses shifted, hooves pressing lightly into the dirt as they turned, and within seconds, the line that had stood before the house began to move away, not defeated, not denied, simply respecting what had been chosen. Ethan remained where he was, watching them go, the dust rising softly behind them, and only when they had put enough distance between themselves and the house did he exhale, slow and steady. Behind him, the open doorway remained, the chain still catching the last of the light, and in that quiet space between what had been offered and what had been refused, something else had taken its place, something that could not be bought, could not be taken, only recognized when it stood right in front of you. The dust settled slowly after the riders turned away, not in a rush, not in defeat, but in a quiet acceptance that matched the way they had arrived. And Ethan Cole stood there watching until the shapes of horse and riders softened into the horizon, until the line they had drawn faded into nothing more than memory. He did not move right away, did not turn back toward the house, because something in him understood that moments like this did not end when the people left. They lingered, they settled into the ground beneath your boots and changed the way you stood on it. The wind came back first, brushing across the open land in a low breath, carrying the faint echo of hoofbeats already gone, and only then did Ethan shift, just slightly, his shoulders easing, not from relief, but from the absence of something that had been pressing against him without weight. Behind him, the house remained open, the doorway still wide, and he could feel her presence there without looking, steady, unchanged, like the land itself. He took a slow breath, then another, and finally turned, not with urgency, not with uncertainty, just with the quiet of a man who no longer needed to guess what came next. She stood where he had last seen her, just outside the doorway now, fully in the fading light, her gaze no longer fixed on the horizon but on him. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence between them was different now, no longer tense, no longer waiting, just present, like something that had found its place. Ethan stepped forward once, closing a small part of the distance, then stopped, leaving space where it needed to remain. "They will not come back like that," he said, his voice low, not as reassurance, but as observation. She nodded once, her expression calm. "No," she said. "They saw what they needed to see." Ethan let that settle, because he knew she was not talking about herself. His eyes drifted briefly past her into the house, where the table still held the chain, the faint glint now softer in the evening light. "That was yours," he said, gesturing slightly with his chin toward it. She followed his glance, then looked back at him. "It was given," she replied. Ethan gave a small nod, understanding more now than before. "Then it was not meant to stay on that table," he said. She did not move right away, and for a moment it seemed like she might leave it there, like it had already done what it needed to do. But then she turned, stepping back inside with quiet purpose, her movements unhurried, natural, like she was no longer crossing into something unfamiliar. Ethan remained where he was, watching from the doorway as she reached the table and picked up the chain, her fingers closing around it with a familiarity that matched the way he had held it earlier, only steadier. She looked at it for a second, then slipped it over her head, letting it rest where it belonged, the symbol settling against her chest as if it had never left. When she turned back, the light caught it again, but this time it did not feel like something out of place. It felt like something restored. She stepped back to the doorway, stopping just inside, and for the first time since he had arrived, the house behind her no longer felt empty. It felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. "You did not have to stand there," she said, her voice quieter now, not distant, just closer. Ethan shook his head once. "I did," he replied, simple, without explanation. She studied him for a moment, as if measuring that answer, then gave the smallest nod, accepting it for what it was. The wind moved again, softer this time, and the last of the sun dipped lower, stretching shadows long across the ground. Ethan glanced once more toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, then back at her. "What will you do now?" he asked. It was the first real question he had asked her, not about what she was, not about what had happened, but about what came next. She held his gaze, steady, thoughtful, and for a moment it seemed like she might answer right away, but instead she looked past him, out at the open land that stretched in every direction, then back again. "That depends," she said. Ethan felt a faint shift in his chest at the words, not uncertainty, but something else, something that had not been there before. "On what?" he asked. She stepped forward just enough that the space between them changed, not closed, just different. "On whether this place is just something you bought," she said, "or something you understand." The words settled between them, quiet, deliberate, and Ethan realized that the moment with the riders had not been the end of anything. It had only been the beginning of something he had not yet decided how to face. The question lingered in the air longer than the fading light, and Ethan Cole did not answer right away because it was not the kind of question a man answered with words alone. He stood there just outside the doorway, boots planted in dry earth that had not changed, yet felt different under him, as if the ground itself was asking the same thing. The wind moved low across the plain, quieter now, carrying none of the tension from before, only the steady breath of open land that did not belong to anyone who tried to claim it. Ethan glanced past her into the dim interior of the house, the table, the empty space where the chain had been, the rough walls that held nothing but shadow and memory. And for a moment he saw it the way he had when he first stepped inside, just a structure, something bought, something simple. Then he looked back at her, at the way she stood not as part of it, but apart from it, and something in that view shifted the meaning of everything around them. "I paid for it," he said slowly, not as an answer, but as the truth he had carried into this moment. She did not react, did not challenge, only listened. "But that does not mean I understand it," he continued, his voice quieter now, less certain in tone but more honest in weight. She studied him for a long second, her gaze steady, and there was something in it now that was not testing him, not measuring him, but recognizing the difference between what a man says to defend himself and what he says when he begins to see something clearly. "Most men do not say that," she replied. Ethan gave a faint shrug, the movement small, almost tired. "Most men are not standing here right now," he said. The corner of her expression shifted again, that almost smile that never fully formed, but this time it lingered just a second longer. The light had dropped lower now, the sky stretching into deeper tones, and the long shadows from the house reached farther across the ground, touching the space where the riders had stood, as if the moment they left had not completely gone. Ethan stepped forward again, one slow step closer to the doorway, closing part of the distance between them, but still leaving room where it needed to be. "You asked what this place is to me," he said, his voice steady again, but different now, less guarded, "and I do not have an answer yet." She did not interrupt, did not rush him. "But I know what it is not," he added. "It is not something that comes with a person attached to it." The words settled between them, simple, direct, and something in the air seemed to ease further, like a knot loosening without being pulled. She took a step forward then, matching his movement, and for the first time they stood close enough that the space between them felt intentional, not uncertain. "Then you understand more than you think," she said softly. Ethan shook his head once, a faint breath leaving him. Understanding something and knowing what to do with it are not the same thing, he replied. She held his gaze, and this time there was no distance in it at all, only clarity. "No," she said, "they are not." The wind brushed past them again, carrying a slight chill now as the sun dipped lower, and the world seemed to settle into that quiet place between day and night where decisions felt heavier, more real. Ethan looked out across the land again, the open stretch that had drawn him here in the first place. The silence he had thought he wanted, and for the first time, it did not feel empty. It felt unfinished. "If you leave," he said, turning his head slightly back toward her, "this place stays what it was when I bought it." She did not answer immediately, but her eyes followed his gaze out across the horizon, then returned. "And if I stay?" she asked. Ethan paused, not because he did not have words, but because he understood that whatever he said next would shape more than just the moment. He looked at her fully, steady, and answered without hesitation this time. "Then it becomes something else," he said. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything he had said before, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The sky dimmed another shade, the last light catching briefly on the silver at her chest, and in that quiet space between what had been bought and what could be chosen, Ethan Cole realized that the question she had asked him was not about land, or ownership, or even understanding. It was about whether he was willing to let something change, and whether he had the courage to stand in that change once it did. The last light held on the horizon like it was deciding whether to stay or leave, and Ethan Cole felt that same quiet hesitation settle somewhere deep in his chest, not as doubt, but as awareness that whatever came next would not be undone once it was chosen. He stood there with the open land stretching out in front of him and the doorway at his back, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel pulled in two directions. He felt held in one place, steady, grounded by something he had not planned for. She remained close, just inside the edge of the doorway, the silver at her chest catching the fading light in soft flashes, not bright, not demanding, just present, like it had always belonged there. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence was no longer empty. It was full of something that did not need to be said. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dry earth, and let his gaze drift once more across the land, the same land he had thought would give him distance from everything he had walked away from, the same land that now seemed to be asking something back. "You said it becomes something else," she said quietly, her voice carrying without effort in the still air. Ethan did not turn right away. He let the words sit, then nodded once, slow. "It does," he answered. "But that does not mean it becomes easy." She stepped forward another half step, closing the space just enough that the distance between them no longer felt like uncertainty, only respect. "Nothing that matters ever is," she replied. Ethan let out a faint breath at that, something close to agreement, something closer to acceptance. The wind brushed past again, cooler now, carrying the quiet of evening across the open ground, and the sky above had begun to deepen into darker shades that softened the edges of everything below. He turned then, fully this time, facing her without the distraction of the horizon behind him, and in that moment, the space between them felt clearer than anything he had known since he stepped onto this land. "If you stay," he said, his voice steady. It will not be because I asked you to. She held his gaze, not surprised, not uncertain. And if I leave, she said, it will not be because they came for me. The balance of it settled between them, equal, unforced, and Ethan nodded again, recognizing the truth in it. Then whatever happens next, he said, is not something either of us owes to anyone else. She did not answer right away, and for a moment her eyes drifted past him again, out toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, where the land returned to silence and distance, and then back to him. That is not how most people live, she said. Ethan gave a small, almost quiet smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Most people do not end up here, he replied. The corner of her expression shifted again, that same trace of something softer, and this time it stayed a second longer. The last line of sunlight slipped lower, touching the edge of the doorway, the table inside, and for a brief moment, the interior of the house seemed less like a place left behind and more like something waiting to be defined. Ethan glanced back at it, then returned his gaze to her. You asked if this place is something I understand, he said. I think I am starting to. She watched him carefully, and there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, not just recognition, not just curiosity, but something closer to trust, not given, but beginning. Understanding is not the end of it, she said. Ethan nodded. No, he agreed. It is where it starts. The wind settled again, the quiet deepening as night approached, and for the first time since the moment began, nothing felt unfinished, nothing felt uncertain, only open. Ethan Cole stood there, not as a man who had bought a piece of land, not as someone who had been handed something he did not ask for, but as someone who had stepped into a moment that asked more of him than he expected, and had not stepped away. And in the stillness that followed, with the last light fading and the land stretching wide around them, it became clear that what would happen next would not be shaped by what had been traded or taken, but by what was chosen, quietly, deliberately, and without anyone needing to say it aloud. The night settled in slowly, not all at once, but in layers, like the land was folding into itself after a long day of holding its breath, and Ethan Cole remained where he stood, feeling that quiet settle into him as well, not heavy, not pressing, just present. The sky had turned a deep shade of blue, almost black at the edges, and the first stars had begun to show, faint but steady. Like they had been waiting for this exact moment to return, he did not rush inside, did not step away from where he stood, because something about this place, about this moment, asked for stillness, not movement. She remained near the doorway, the silver at her chest now catching only the faintest light, no longer shining, but still visible, like something that did not need brightness to exist. For a long second, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them carried no questions now, only space. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the air cooler, sharper, and let it out just as slowly, his eyes drifting once more across the open land, the same land that had felt empty when he arrived, and now felt like it was watching, not judging, just aware. It is quieter now, he said, not because it needed to be said, but because it was true. She nodded once, her gaze following his out into the darkening distance. Was always quiet, she replied. You just hear it differently now. Ethan let that settle, because he knew she was right, even if he could not explain why. He shifted his stance slightly, not from discomfort, but from the sense that standing in one place too long without speaking might leave something unfinished. You could have gone with them, he said after a moment, his voice low, not questioning her choice, just acknowledging it. She did not look at him right away, her eyes still on the horizon. I could have, she said. Another pause, not empty, not uncertain, just part of the rhythm that had formed between them. But I did not, she added. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without needing more. He turned then, finally stepping back into the house, not as a retreat, but as a continuation, his boots sounding softer now against the wooden floor, like even the space inside had changed. She followed a moment later, not close, not distant, just present, and the doorway behind them remained open, letting the night air move through the room in slow, steady breaths. Ethan glanced around, taking in the rough table, the walls, the empty spaces that had once felt like something to fill and now felt like something to understand. There is not much here, he said, almost to himself. She stepped further in, her eyes moving over the same space, but seeing something different. There is enough, she replied. Ethan gave a faint, thoughtful nod at that, because he was starting to see what she meant, not in objects, not in things, but in what the space allowed. He moved toward the table, resting his hand lightly against its worn surface, the place where the chain had been lying not long ago, and for a moment he traced the grain of the wood with his fingers, as if feeling for something left behind. I thought I came here to be left alone, he said quietly. She stopped a few steps away, watching him. And now? She asked. Ethan paused, the question settling into him deeper than the ones before, because it did not ask about the land or the past, but about something he had not fully named yet. He lifted his hand from the table and turned slightly toward her, the dim light outlining his features in softer lines. Now I think I came here to see what I would do when I was not, he answered. The words came without hesitation, but they carried a weight that lingered after they were spoken. She held his gaze, and for a moment there was no distance between them at all, only a shared understanding that had not been there before. The wind moved through the open doorway again, brushing past them, carrying the quiet of the land inside, and neither of them moved to close it. Outside, the stars grew brighter, the horizon fading into darkness, and inside that small, worn house, something had shifted into place without being forced, without being claimed. Ethan Cole stood there, no longer measuring what he had gained or lost, no longer weighing what was his or what was not, only aware that the choice he had made earlier had not ended anything. It had opened something he had not known he was looking for. And in the quiet that followed, with the night settling fully around them, that realization felt steadier than anything he had carried before. The night deepened around the small house, not as something that closed in, but as something that settled gently over everything. And Ethan Cole stood there for a long moment without moving, feeling the quiet press and not as weight, but as presence. The open doorway behind him let the cool air drift through, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distance. And somewhere far off, a night bird called once before falling silent again. Inside, the room held its stillness, the table, the worn boards, the empty spaces no longer feeling like absence, but like something waiting to be shaped by what came next. He turned slightly, his gaze moving to her where she stood near the edge of the room, the silver at her chest catching the faintest trace of starlight now, no longer bright, but steady. You said there is enough here, he said quietly, his voice low so it did not break the calm that had settled between them. She nodded once, her eyes moving slowly around the room before returning to him. There is enough if it is not taken for granted, she replied. Ethan let out a slow breath at that, the kind that came when a man recognized something simple that had taken him too long to understand. He walked a few steps further inside, not claiming the space, not testing it, just moving through it as if learning it for the first time. I used to think enough meant having less, he said, his tone thoughtful, not heavy. Less noise, less people, less trouble. She watched him without interrupting, her expression calm, patient. And now? She asked. Ethan paused near the table, resting his hand lightly against its edge again, the wood cool under his palm. He considered the question, not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted to speak it clearly. Now I think enough means knowing what not to take, he said. The words settled into the room, quiet, but firm, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly through the doorway again, brushing past them like a reminder of the land outside, the land that had not changed, only the way he stood in it. She stepped closer then, not closing the distance fully, but enough that her presence felt shared, not separate. That is where most men fail, she said. Ethan gave a faint nod, not in agreement alone, but in recognition. I have failed there before, he admitted, the honesty simple, unguarded. She studied him for a moment, and there was no judgment in her gaze, only understanding. You did not fail today, she said. Ethan did not answer right away, because he knew the truth of that was not something to accept too easily, but he did not deny it either. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward the open doorway, looking out into the night where the land stretched beyond sight. And for the first time, he did not feel like it was something to disappear into, but something to stand within. Tomorrow will come, he said after a moment, his voice steady. And with it, more choices. She followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. It always does, she replied. The simplicity of it carried a quiet certainty that matched the rhythm of the land itself. Ethan stepped toward the doorway then, stopping just at the threshold, not stepping out, not closing it, just standing where inside met outside. You can stay, said, not turning, not looking back at her. The words offered without weight, without expectation. Or you can leave when you choose. Behind him, there was a pause, not hesitation, but consideration, and then her voice came, calm, steady. I will stay for now, she said. Ethan nodded once, a small motion, accepting it without question, without need for more. The wind moved again, softer now, and the stars above held their quiet light, watching over a place that had not changed, yet was no longer the same. Inside that small, worn house, with nothing added and nothing taken, something had settled into place, not owned, not claimed, just understood. And as the night carried on, steady and silent, Ethan Cole remained at the threshold, not as a man who had bought something, not as someone who had been given something he did not expect, but as a man who had finally learned the difference between having and holding, and who understood, without needing to say it, that out here, the only thing that truly stayed was what you chose not to take.